If the environment is broken, then switching out the people isn't going to have any impact. You need to fix the environment for anyone to have any kind of impact. If you're still not getting the results that you want, then fire the team, replace them with better people. You lose sight of, are you actually delivering impact for your customers? And you start to ignore some of the other ways that you can have impact that might be a lot faster and a lot more efficient. Having learned the rules, you can break the rules. And sometimes breaking the rules is better for you and it's better for the product and the customer. For me, there's only one test. The test is, are you making your customers happy? Are you making your business more valuable?
Being full stack means abandoning what everybody is telling you to do and figuring out in your situation what you need to do.
Go and do the bold things that are really going to drive impact. Go and do the things that you think or you know are right. You get teams who are like, oh, we need to build this thing because so-and-so said we need to build this thing. And they don't have a clue about really what they're building or why. Working smart and on the most important things is much more important than working hard.
Progress is inversely proportional to the number of priorities we have. You've said product purists aren't great PMs. Explain.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most common frustrations I see at the VP and the CPO level is
Ed, welcome to the Product Growth Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Akash, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me along.
So if you don't know Ed, not only is he an experienced product leader, but he's also a prolific content creator. He wrote one of the most popular guest pieces on the Product Growth newsletter ever, with over 255 likes on Substack, which is quite a lot for our newsletter in that platform. He also collaborated on our fractional product leadership post, which was widely shared with over 200 shares. And he's able to produce such great content because he was an SVP of Product at Jobandtalent, CPO at FutureLearn, Director of Product at Depop, and Director of Product at Rocket Internet. He also had a long career before that, stretching back to 2004, where he was an associate at McKinsey. Simply put, Ed is one of the most experienced people in the product field. Lately, he's been applying his expertise as an interim CPTO at FYLD, and as a founder of Hustle Badger, a paid subscription for PM career newsletters and courses. Today, we're going to explore some of the spiciest takes Ed has on product management. So let's get right into it. You've said many founders who want to replace their entire product team are blaming PMs for their own shortcomings as leaders. First, why do so many founders want to replace their product team, and why are they blaming the product team for their own shortcomings?
Look, I think fundamentally, product teams are expensive to run, right? So if you're a founder, you're looking at the cost of running your business. Maybe you're worried about your burn rate. And I always use the rule of thumb that a product team is going to cost about $1 million a year to run. And so if you're seeing that money going out the door and you're not feeling you're getting huge amounts of value in return, then naturally you're going to start to question what's going wrong, what the problems are, and how you can get it back on track. And I think the problem is that, fundamentally, the results you get out of your product team, they're a function of the people you've got and the environment that they're in. So yes, of course, you can replace the people that you've got. But if the environment is broken, then switching out the people isn't going to have any impact. You need to fix the environment for anyone to have any kind of impact.
So what do you reckon, of these people, these founders who want to replace their product team, how many of them is it their shortcomings versus the people they hired?
That's a controversial question for sure. I guess the way I think about it is that you don't know, right? You've got two unknowns there. And all you know is you're not getting the results that you want. And I always say, look, it's easier to fix the environment and you've got to do it anyway. So start with that, be quicker, faster, more pleasant. And if you're still not getting the results that you want, then fire the team, replace them with better people.
Is your product team having trouble in capturing the true voice of customers? That's because user feedback is scattered across channels, making it nearly impossible to catch crucial conversations. It's time you're able to centralize your voice of customer from everything like your CRM, customer portals, call recordings, or even public reviews. That's where Zeta.io comes in, our podcast partner today. With Zeta's AI, you can plug your customer conversations in, and it will allow you to easily slice and dice these into actionable insights for your key product areas so that you can do more to improve NPS scores, analyze features, identify new features, or perhaps understand why you lost a few deals. This paves the way for planning the right features and channeling your efforts into actually planning and building your roadmap to finally close that loop 10 times faster. Product managers around the world use Zeta.io and use it to really improve their product discovery. It's plug and play in just minutes. So visit zeta.io/LPS/Akash Gupta to get an extra 10% off. Quicker, faster, more pleasant. So are those kind of the three things that are the main shortcomings? I can kind of chime in with some of my things that I felt as a product leader were difficult from founders. One is like consistent reorganization of the product team under you, which causes like no PM to be able to fully grasp their area. Another that I tend to encounter a lot is product leaders wanting to empower their product teams, but then literally dictating all of the details. Are these similar symptoms that you've also seen?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's very, very common to see both of those things. Something I see a lot is that CEOs have this grand vision for where they want to take the company. They've got amazing industry knowledge, and they're not actually sharing that much with the product teams. And then they're frustrated that the product teams who have 5-10 years of experience instead of 10 or 20 years of experience like they do, aren't coming up with great ideas. I'm just like, well, if you'd shared some of that context, if you shared some of your knowledge and you gave really clear direction about what you wanted, you're immediately going to see better results, almost guaranteed. So for me, like the best thing you can do, or the biggest first step, is make sure you're setting appropriate expectations and giving as much context as possible.
Makes sense. So as a founder, you probably were the initial customer success person. You were the initial ops person. You were the initial product manager. And I think that context is very hard to actually share. What are the better and worse ways to try to share that context?
Yeah, so I recommend people share what you want, like a context doc, a snap strategy, a one pager. It's literally like, as the founder, as a CEO, how would you describe what is going on in the company in one page? So that means like, what is your ambition? Like, what are the financial results that you're aiming for? And you usually have a sense of that because of your burn rate or the investment milestones you need to hit, or just what you grew last year, whatever it is. You want to have a sense of a little bit of like what's going on in the industry and things that may have changed in the rest of the organization. And then you want to tell people like, what are the key bits of work that you think you should focus on and why? And that you might call your strategic pillars or something. And basically, if you've got those things, then you're in a position to start having a good conversation about what should be done. But I think if you don't have that conversation and you just say to your teams like, hey, go build some stuff, or almost like the opposite of that, say like, go build this widget, then you're going to go and get things that aren't actually that helpful, because they'll go and do something that's completely unrelated to the company strategy on the one hand, or the kind of widgets example, they'll build a widget that in a one-line description is the same as yours, but you'll both have very different ideas of what this is. And you'll end up, again, kind of disappointed with what they've built.
Okay. And that's the founder side. On the product manager side, if you're in this situation, if you suspect that your founder might be unhappy about how people are gaining context, what are the things you might do in that position to have a better understanding, to get that founder level intuition about what to build?
Yeah, I mean, in the best case, you can just ask for it, right? You say like, hey, what is the strategy here? But obviously, most of the time that doesn't work, right? There's a reason why people haven't written it. The founders think that everyone knows it already, or it's obvious, or they don't have time for it. And so, much more practically speaking, you write the briefing yourself. You write that snap strategy, say like, hey, this is what I understand about what the company is trying to achieve, how we grow, how we're going to achieve that growth. This is our model of how things work. And then you share it, and you share it with the founder and the CEO and say, hey, is this right? Because it's much easier for the CEO to jump in and be like, oh, this is wrong, and correct you, than it is for them to write the whole thing from a blank sheet of paper. So yeah, I'd say just get going, write it yourself. You'll probably be 80% right. And where you're wrong, that's not a failure. That's your learning opportunity, right? You're going to frame it like that. Say like, hey, this is what I understand. Can you correct me? Am I making any mistakes? Is there anything else I need to know?
Okay, so put it in writing, try to get specific. And it sounds like the level to which to do this context alignment is really on the strategy. So that's kind of like is that like the 0 to 12 month aperture of what are the high level big rocks that are problems you're going to solve?
I think that's the place to start, right? I mean, it depends on the scale you're working at. So you need that at the company level. If you're a founder, if you're a VP of product and you're thinking about the whole product team, you need that at the individual level. If you're at the team level, if you're an individual PM. And so it's just a question of how much detail you're going to go into.
So another one of your hot takes I really like, and I think this has gone viral on LinkedIn a couple times, is you've said product purists aren't great PMs. Explain.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most common frustrations I see at the VP and the CPO level is that they're getting pushback from their teams because the product managers have this very set in stone way that they think product management needs to be done. And as a result, that's actually slowing things down. So these PMs know that you're meant to do discovery, you're meant to speak to your customers, you're meant to have the right frameworks and all these things that are not like bad in their own right. But when they become sort of ossified, when they become like the only way that you can work, then you lose sight of what the company is actually trying to achieve. You lose sight of, are you actually delivering impact for your customers? And you start to ignore some of the other ways that you can have impact that might be a lot faster and a lot more efficient.
So why do people fall into this purist trap? Because I've also noticed this, a lot of VP friends complaining to me. Is it because they read Marty Kagan's Inspired and that was their main reference point for product management? Is it because of these influencers talking about bullshit management? Or what is kind of causing this root cause problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Marty in some ways has a bit to answer for this because he's so great at evangelizing a really good way of working. And I think where people misinterpret it is they misinterpret it as the only way of working. And I can imagine, because I went through this myself, I went through this phase very much where you're starting out in your product management career, you're listening to all these people who've got different views on what you should be doing. And as you start to piece it together, you start to build this framework of how things should be done. And so you have this framework, but actually you're lacking some of the experience about the results that delivers. And then you start to kind of mature out of it because you learn that actually, having learned the rules, you can break the rules. And sometimes breaking the rules is better for you and it's better for the product and the customer.
Yeah, we had Sam Kasarani on the episode about a month ago, and he said that, in certain wartime environments, if you have only 0 to 3 months runway, or if the company needs to make a huge pivot, of course, executives are going to be getting into the decisions. They're going to be dictating features. Is that the type of scenario where PMs just need to embrace that it might not be the pure way of doing things? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a great example. Like if you've got 3 months to live in your company, then the execs, the leadership, they probably got very clear ideas about what they want to build, what are the bets they're going to take over that time, and they want to get those out the door as fast as possible to see if they work. And they've probably got good reasons themselves for trying those ideas, right? Because they've done it before in a previous company or they've done their own research, right? And that's fine. Like as a PM, your job is to reduce risk, and help people make smart technology investments. But if someone's already done that risk reduction, or if they're happy taking a bigger risk in a particular area, then you really need to lean into that and help them get done what they're trying to get done.
So kind of embrace what leadership is telling you to do based on the business context and try not to be as idealistic. At the same time, I guess, we do want our product managers to improve our product processes. What's like the right line for pushing back, trying to make things be done in a better way versus just embracing this messy reality that you live in?
Yeah, and I try not to think about it as, do whatever your boss tells you to, because that's not like a constructive way of thinking about it, right? I try to think about this as firstly, really understand what leadership wants of you in depth. In the same way you'd understand your customers and what their needs are, understand what leaders are trying to achieve and what their context is. Like, leaders are very rarely like stupid or misinformed. They've got good reasons, good ideas for what they're doing. They may not be sharing those ideas and that context with you very well. So really understand what is the problem, and then understand what is the role that you are doing. Like, what is the solution you're providing? Like, are you there to reduce certain risks, value risk, usability risk, technical risk, or are you there just to ship things? If you're just there to ship things, all day, every day, well, yeah, that might not be the role that you want to be in if you consider yourself a product manager. But if that is something that, needs must for a 2-month period so you can get something out the door, I think that is a great way to work. And I think that becomes more important as you get more senior, actually, because there are different types of work. Sometimes you need to be very innovative and you need to create new things, and that's difficult and that requires a lot of discovery. Sometimes, actually, you don't need to be super innovative. You need to integrate with a payment system, or you need to have a new CRM provider. And in that case, you don't need to go and do discovery from the ground floor, right? You can just make a quick decision, ship it, and move on. And that is going to reduce the opportunity cost. It's going to reduce the cost of delivery. And that's going to be the best answer, probably in the long term.
When you've been in those situations yourself and you're being the team player and you're just going ahead and helping the company ship it, how do you try to chip in and add some value in terms of reducing risk? Is it about squeezing in some usability tests with a prototype, even though you already have the feature? Is it about doing some user interviews to back up and solve the problem? Like, how do you think about the aperture, the right stage to add that value?
Yeah. The first thing I do is, write that PRD, write that strategy doc, whatever you call it. Don't just accept the kind of one-line description. Oh, we need, bundle deals, or we need, more filters on search. Take a step back and be like, okay, I think we need this. I think you're asking for this because you're trying to increase conversion and your hypothesis is X, Y, Z. So just write that down so you can reflect it back and understand it. Then you can just bullet point, hey, this is probably a good idea because we've seen X, Y, and Z, and our outstanding risks remaining are A, B, and C. And that's something you can do all of that work, all that thinking on your own. And again, share it with the stakeholders once you've written it down. If you've made a mistake, if they've got more context to share, it's then much easier for them to correct you than to spell it all out from scratch. And once you've got that common understanding, and that you need to come at that from a generous point of view, right? You've got to kind of assume that they are working in the best interest of the company. They are smart people. They are trying to succeed like you. And you've given them that kind of benefit of the doubt. Let them give you more context. And then if there are still risks remaining, that is the time to sort of say, okay, we still have a bit of a risk here around usability. Is this something that you want me to go and fix? Or are you happy for us just to take an off-the-shelf solution? And then it's almost like discovery as a service. You say, hey, I can go and ship this as fast as possible, and that's going to be one risk profile. Or I can take some time, I can go and do some customer interviews, and then I can ship it. It's going to take a little bit longer, but I think we'll get better results. That's a really healthy conversation to have. You're helping your stakeholders get the best possible outcomes. You're not kind of going and doing stuff behind their back or without their knowledge, right? But you are kind of using your expertise as a product manager of the product development process to get the best outcomes possible.
That is so insightful. I feel like a lot of product managers really need to hear that, which is don't go and do stuff behind their back. It's about creating that discussion. So whether it's the product review or a Slack saying, hey, I still see this risk out here. Here's a mitigation plan. It might take me a week to execute. Would you like me to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing is if you highlight a risk and say, hey, I'm worried that users aren't going to understand how to use this. And maybe you've got a couple of data points that ask why. You can just ask the stakeholder, is this something you're worried about? And they might come back and say, you know what, I'm not worried about it because I've seen this implemented before in another company. Actually, I feel this is very similar to another feature we've got. Or they might say, yeah, actually, I hadn't really thought about that. That's a really good idea. So again, once you can open up those conversations in quite non-confrontational ways and quite collaborative ways. And I think it really helps build trust and drive productive conversations between the two of you.
Makes sense. And a tool I saw someone on my team actually use with me was Itamar Gilad's evidence meter. And despite being in the PM content space, I hadn't seen it until he showed it to me. But he kind of showed me like, hey, like we're on like this, confidence 5, but Itamar has these levels all the way to 100. Do you want us to crank up the level? Do you like that sort of framing? Is that a potentially useful technique people can use?
I love that framing. I think, Itamar Gilad's confidence meter, I think, is one of the kind of frameworks that's really stuck with me. It's something actually when I run workshops with teams, I often get them to define their own confidence scale or confidence meter. I'm saying like, okay, what is the hierarchy of confidence? What is the sort of, intuition to, group thinking to anecdotal data? You can define sort of however many levels you want, maybe 4 or 5 levels. You can then brainstorm all the different data points you'd have and kind of categorize them between those different levels. And then you can say, okay, when we feed this into our models, when we feed this into our prioritization, if we're using RICE, like what is that C figure that we discount things by? What is that percentage for each of these levels? That's a really good conversation to have, because when you have that as a conversation amongst the team and you workshop it together, everyone has that understanding of what it means to be confident about different things and really start to internalize it. And that's obviously, the most important thing, right? That everyone understands what we're talking about. We've got this common language to discuss confidence.
Oh, I really like that, because sometimes people do push back on the numbers he has. So why don't we create the confidence meter ourselves? And if we want to make it a hierarchy or a pyramid or whatever we want, we can do that. But let's agree that, just the founder deciding isn't the highest confidence thing we have.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we've really focused on purity as it relates to not being in a feature factory, doing discovery. I think there's probably another element to the purity statement that I want to unpack, which is around what work you do and how you relate to your counterparts in design and engineering. I tend to find that there's a certain brand of junior PM, and like you said, it's almost like the life cycle of a PM. You almost just have to go through this chapter where the PM, the engineer might have like super specific questions about implementation. And instead of diving into the details, they'll say, well, you just figure it out. Or the designer might ask, oh, can you please help write the QA document? I'm busy. And they'll be like, well, I thought that was you guys, or can't QA do that? How do you think they should handle sort of purity with respect to responsibilities with their counterparts?
Yeah. I certainly seen when I go into leadership roles in companies, one of the first things we end up doing is doing roles and responsibilities between the different disciplines. And I think that's really valuable for, again, just to workshopping that, accepting there's no kind of absolutes about what everyone should do, but by workshopping, you're developing that shared understanding of how things are going to work in this context, in this company. And once you've done that, you can share it out to the teams, and obviously they can adjust it a little bit if for their particular team they want it to work slightly differently. I think what's important to recognize is that there's a lot of different jobs to do in a team, from writing code and breaking down tickets and speaking to customers and speaking to stakeholders and all these sorts of things. And in a good team, a lot of people can do a lot of those different things. Some of them will be very specialized, writing code, using Figma, and some of them will be generalist things that anyone could do, speaking to stakeholders, say. So you've just got to be careful that you spread the responsibilities that the team needs to cover as a whole amongst the individuals that you've got. And you accept that if someone is going to have a broad remit, they're going to do each of those things to a shallower depth of quality, just because they've got a fixed amount of time. And again, that's then a productive conversation about how are you going to use your time as a team, together really well. And it's less about sort of pushing papers, across the desk or across the line to someone else to handle or someone else to worry about.
So we talked about tactically creating like a hierarchy together. Tactically, how do we discuss roles and responsibilities without being too hand wavy? Because I've noticed that I probably made this mistake in the past where I agree on roles and responsibilities, but we don't necessarily have a good way to write it down. We just put some bullet points in our Notion meeting notes, and then 2 months later, we have completely different interpretations about what those roles and responsibilities we agreed on were.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've always done this is get a cross-function of the disciplines in the team. So the engineering, design, product, that often includes data, and asked everyone just to write down, 6 to 12 things that they think are the most important things that they're doing on a week-to-week basis. And then for each of those things, you stick those in a long list, and then you can take out all the duplicates, of which there'll be several. And then, I quite like using RACI or something like this. So, who is responsible? So who's actively involved in doing this work? Who's accountable? So that's the single person. It's got to be at least one person who is taking ownership for that, and they're the one that ensures quality. Who's consulted? So who else is kind of involved? 2 ways. You're going to ask for their feedback. They're going to give it. And who's on a sort of input basis, or kind of informed basis, sorry. So you're going to tell them what you're doing, but they're not going to give you any feedback on how it's done. So long list of tasks. You can each fill out yourselves what you think that should look. So for each task, for each function, so product, design, engineering, you're going to assign one of those different roles. And then basically you're going to compare between what everyone's got. And for a lot of them, probably 70, 80% of those, everyone will have the same thing. And then 1 or 2 cases, you're going to get a discussion where someone's saying like, oh, I thought design would be accountable for this. You're like, no, product should be accountable for this. Great. That's where you focus your time and actually thrash out what you're talking about. And usually what I found is that comes down to how you've written the task out. Because designers are like, oh yeah, when I said we should come up with all the solutions, right? What I meant was we should come up with the designs and we should write them out, and product's going to do something else, right? Yeah. So you then kind of work out the wording that gets everyone satisfied and is specific enough that everyone knows what you're talking about. And again, the benefit is not that you have a nice, neat document at the end of it. The benefit is you have all those discussions and you have that shared understanding of what everyone's doing. And if you do it in a large company at the leadership level, or if you do it in a smaller company at the team level, leaders can cascade that understanding down to their direct reports. Or if you're in a team, then you've just got that understanding amongst all of you straight away.
Makes sense. One thing I've encountered is that sometimes the senior leaders, they're used to older ways of working than the team members on the ground. So you might have a CTO that firmly believes that the product manager has to enter all the Jira user stories. But then the actual team is like, well, actually as tech leads and engineering managers, we prefer to create those stories after we get shared context in a meeting and a PRD from the PM. How do you kind of negotiate in this cascading process the right sort of company culture, but also then team specific culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's always a bit of feedback between the culture that leaders are trying to build intentionally, the people you're hiring, and the feedback you get from the teams about how they want to work, right? So it's not like there's a directional flow from any one of those 3 points in any particular direction. Those are all sort of interacting with each other on a continuing basis. So if leaders are intentionally trying to build a culture that just does not sit right with the bulk of the product and engineering teams, then that should come up, either because people are kind of sticking up their hand and saying, hey, this isn't really working for us, or it should come up in team surveys if you're doing that sort of thing, or it can be escalated through group product managers and whoever else. There should be ways of kind of making that a discussion point if it's a real pain point. And similarly, if for whatever reason you've got a very opinionated way that you want to build your culture, and that is not how 90% of teams build their culture, you really need to reflect that in how you're hiring and make sure people understand that when they're coming in. And then you need to be reinforcing that all the time to make sure that you've got a consistent culture.
Makes sense. So now I want to transition to another one of your hot takes, which is One that I think maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, everyone would have nodded their head. But I've noticed recently on social media, when I post things along these lines, I get a lot more backlash. And it's this idea that PMs should be full stack. So what does full stack mean to you?
Full stack for me comes back to that idea of, sometimes as a PM, you're walking into the unknown. There's a lot of discovery to do, and the bulk of the work, the bulk of the problem to solve is figuring out like what is the problem you're going to fix and how you're going to fix it. And sometimes you're not walking into the unknown. Sometimes you're walking a well-trodden path. You need to build some stuff, and you can be fairly sure that that's going to deliver impact. And in that case, what you need to do is really like get through the design bit as fast as possible and start shipping, because it's the shipping that's going to unlock that value for your customers. So when I talk about full stack, I mean PMs who can work effectively in both of those different situations, because the success mode for one of those is the failure mode for the other. So if I expand a little bit, if you are very good at the discovery piece, you're very good at kind of figuring out those unknowns, you love doing discovery and speaking to users and so on. If you do that when the company's decided it needs to integrate with a payments provider and it's decided which one, you're like, great, let's go speak to some users, and you're going to seem like egotistical, like you don't trust anyone else in the organization. You're going to seem obstructive. You're going to seem like you don't understand the bigger picture. What sets you up for success in that like area of unknowns is actually going to set you up for failure in the other phase. So recognizing what phase you're in and being able to bring to bear the skills that are appropriate for that phase is really important.
Okay. And then the other element of full stack, so I think what you said is relatively non-controversial, especially if somebody agrees with everything else we've talked about so far in the conversation. The element of full stack, I think, is that, full stack in engineering is this concept that an engineer, they can do front end and back end. That's usually what it means, and that they can plug into any element of the code base. And so what people have been extrapolating full stack for full stack design and full stack engineering, especially on Twitter, is this idea that like a designer can code, or that a product manager can jump into Figma, or that a product manager, even if they need to, if it's a small change, will jump into the code base and make those changes. So your interpretation of full stack is maybe not that far reaching that they're going to jump into somebody else's roles. It's more that they can do other types of product management, and specifically these two elements that we see, one more like discovery focused and one more shipping focused.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with the way that particularly AI tooling is going, then people are going to start overlapping with each other's roles a little bit more. And that's also a stage thing. So in a startup where you want to move really quickly, where the sort of standards of evidence are probably a little bit lower, you just don't have as much data, you don't have as much risk, and maybe the quality bar is slightly lower, that's going to make a lot more sense, right? You've got fewer people to do the roles, right? So actually, if you've got a designer who can write a bit of front-end code, great, you're going to go really, really quickly, and that's going to be a huge benefit. But in a bigger company, that might not be the way you want to work, might not be a benefit, because actually there's, 53 different workarounds and, edge cases that the front end supports, which the designer's not going to be aware of because they're not familiar with the code base. And if they start messing around, then all sorts of things are going to break, which they don't understand. So I think it's very much again, like, is that beneficial to your context, to your organization or not? And I can see it being really beneficial in some cases and less beneficial in others.
So in the case of a startup, we have Nikita Bayer, for instance, saying that big company product managers are doing no product management because they're not in the pixels. Should PMs try to get into the designs, not just have comment access in Figma, but actually be duplicating their designers' Figma files and tweaking things and creating views themselves?
I think that kind of sort of detailed question of like, what should we be doing, or what are we going to call this, or what is the role? I mean, like for me, there's only one test. The test is like, are you making your customers happy? Are you making your business more valuable? So if that kind of thing helps your team go faster and produce better results, great, go and do it. And if it doesn't help your team, then again, like, don't do it just because Nikita Bayer says you should, right? Because like, what does he know about your company and your context? And it's interesting when you look at a lot of these companies that work in, you know, what seem like radical ways, and they're top companies, and this is a kind of, oh, Lenny's done a breakdown of how Figma builds product or something, like, cool. But they probably work really well for a whole bunch of reasons that are not true in 99% of other companies, right? Because they've got particular founders with very particular skill sets, and they've built a whole culture and set of processes around that then build on each other. And that is great for them. But I think you need to be a little bit careful about saying like, oh, these people are doing great, and therefore that is going to go and work for us. Like what I have found working in lots of different technology companies is that most of them take a fairly mainstream approach, and that works pretty well most of the time. So I think as a starting point, I'd always start with that. What is the mainstream and how does that work? And then if there are problems, if there are things that aren't working, great, let's go and innovate in our process and our culture. Or, you know, if that happens naturally and it's advantageous, fantastic. But I wouldn't go and seek out the radical and the extreme just because it's new and flashy and gimmicky, because that you're just going to waste a lot of time doing stuff that doesn't really make sense.
So really being full stack means abandoning what everybody is telling you to do and figuring out in your situation what you need to do.
Yeah, for me, full stack, I guess in this context, I'd reinterpret it and say like, hey, a great PM, a full stack PM is one that knows enough about the different areas of product management and product development to be a really amazing partner to the other people in the teams, and is someone that can think holistically about the output of the team and how they can create most impact for the team. And maybe that is, you know, traditional PM tasks like writing PRDs and thinking about the strategy and chatting with stakeholders. And maybe that's much more hands-on of, right, you know, drawing up designs and writing out lines of code.
Okay. So you touched on this way at the beginning, but the idea that a product team is expensive to run, I want to double click into that now. How much does it cost to run a product team?
This is going to vary a lot by market, size of team, obviously, and as well the quality that you're hiring at. Because if you're hiring, you know, a bunch of engineers who used to work for Meta, that's obviously a very different cost base to, you know, people who are fresh out of grad school, something. So that said, you know, I always use a rule of thumb of $1 million a year, something like this, because it's a nice round number. It makes it easy to do all the sums. It's probably correct to an order of magnitude. You know, so as a generalization, I'm like, yeah, sure, let's start there. Let's go to $1 million a year, right? It's a lot of money, whichever way you cut it. Like maybe it's a few $100,000, maybe it's like, you know, closer to $2 million or something. Like, but it's a lot of money.
So the idea is to sum up the salaries of the engineers and designers who are dedicated to the team, and probably also the product manager, and then to view that as the cost basis, kind of like the hurdle rate that you as a product team, you need to generate more revenue if top line is what your company cares about, or ideally bottom line if you're profitable, than that cost.
100%. Yeah, so the calculation is very similar, right? It's like number of people in the team times average salary. Make sure you're including all the costs, you know, pension, healthcare, office space, right? All of those sort of like non-take-home pay costs as well, like software they're using. Great. That is your total team cost. That is the cost that as a product leader, you're going to go and negotiate with the CFO, be like, hey, can we have another product team? And they'll be like, well, yeah, how many more millions am I going to get back for it, right? But I think what you got to realize is, you know, for a lot of companies, and particularly the companies that are doing that sort of innovation, that sort of like, oh, we're building new stuff, that is an optional expense for the companies. They don't have to go and make new things. They've got a business that is working fine as is, or maybe it's not working fine as is. Like they've got a business as is. So the question is, do we want to spend $1 million making that product better? Or do we want to spend $1 million on paid advertising? Or do we want to spend $1 million on paying a dividend to shareholders? Like, there are some very real options for CEOs here. And if you don't recognize that, you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're not going to be making decisions with the right level of gravity and the right level of commercial awareness.
And the flip side of this, I think, is that some PMs are going to be really worried right now. They're going to look back at their last year of features and they're going to say, we didn't generate $1 million of profit. In fact, my guess would be that more than half of the product managers out there did not generate $1 million of profit. It might be, though, that they're working on internal tools, or they're working on a platform, or they're working on a relatively underused feature, but they were told to work on that. How do you, as a PM, kind of reconcile that? And how do you make sure that there is an ROI on your product team?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a few kind of coping mechanisms for this way of thinking as well. Because, like, as you say, it could be quite a large burden to bear to think about, oh, shit, I got like $1 million a year to kind of come up with. So firstly, I think most people realize, CEOs, product managers, that the changes that you make when you build product tend to be small but permanent. So when you go and run a marketing campaign, you get fairly quick results. You see how it worked, and then you need to go and find some more money to go and spend on your next campaign. When you build an improvement in product management, if it changes the conversion rate by 2%, that might not seem like a lot, and it might not add up to a lot in the next 12 months. But that 2% improvement should, theoretically persist almost indefinitely. So often this is just a question of what is the payback period, particularly if you're early on in a scaling company's life cycle. You're just like, well, our user base right now is not going to justify us doing anything. But if we don't invest in the product and continually improve it, we're never going to get big enough for the company to be like overall profitable. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. I think the other thing to think about is, if you've been told to go and work on a particular feature or capability for the company, then you don't need to second guess that, right? If someone says, go and build this internal platform, sure, understand why, understand the context, do all that stuff we were talking about earlier, but it's not your role to be like, I don't think I should be working on the internal platform. I think I should be working on the onboarding system. Like, no. Like, someone above your pay grade has made that strategic choice to put you where you are. They've got good reasons for it. They're feeling confident about it. Go and do the best job you can against the problem you've been set, right? And then I think it's more when you're in those roles which you can affect revenue, you can affect the bottom line, when you say, hey, are the ideas that we're thinking about, are they ambitious enough? Are they exciting enough? Like, actually, when we look at what the company is spending on us, does that feel like it's a good investment all around? Are we really kind of stretching ourselves? Because I think a lot of people are just quite cautious by nature, particularly in products and technology, and they're cautious because they get blamed when the site goes down. And companies build this sort of inertia of like, well, we've been building product this way. The app has always had these 3 tabs for the last 5 years. Is it our place to go and change them? I'm just like, well, yeah, if you think it's going to make a difference, then make your case and sure, get sign off for it. But go and do the bold things that are really going to drive impact. Go and do the things that you think or are right. That's often one of the biggest obstacles that product teams have to creating impact. They feel scared of doing the big impactful things for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was an aha moment for me when I started seeing you write about this, because I was actually an active product leader at the time. And it helped me understand, some of our teams that I feel like are generating less than $1 million in profit, maybe we did mistakenly allocate them to an underused feature or mistakenly allocate them to a platform project. So if you are in that position of power, we should really be using this framework to make sure that we are working on bets that can generate enough value, eh?
Absolutely. As a product leader, you really need to have that understanding and be thinking very carefully about how you allocate your teams. Because you should be thinking about this from the CFO's point of view, this kind of portfolio investment point of view, where it's not about the people you've got on the team. That comes at some point, right? You've got to take into account their skills and so on. But really, you're thinking about how much money have I got in my budget and which problems am I going to allocate it against? And what is the change I'm then going to see? And usually that change is like, what is the change I'm going to see in the P&L? Are the costs going to go down? Is the revenue going to go up? Is the retention rate going to go up? There are some key metrics that you want to be moving, and being able to articulate how the allocation of your teams is smart investments to move those metrics is a really important leadership and board conversation to be able to have.
And what are the right tools to do that? Because sometimes, let's say the team has moved up conversion rate by 2%, just to continue on our example. How do you correctly sort of transition that 2% gain into an output metric that could be comparable to the $1 million cost?
Yeah, I think different companies can have this conversation at slightly different levels. And again, like when you're a very early stage company, this is going to be largely a qualitative based discussion. Hey, if we go and work on customer service, can we believe that we'll reduce the cost base by this amount? And does that then have the kind of impact that we're talking about? It's that kind of qualitative, like narrative description about if we do X, then Y, then Z, does that feel kind of right? As you get more analysis, tracking, insights in your business, as the business get a little bit bigger, you start to be able to have those conversations on a more quantitative basis. So you start to be able to say, okay, well, let's identify the metrics here. Let's identify that driver tree. If we can move this leading metric, what is the relationship between that one and the lagging metric, the business metric that we really care about? And at some point, you've done enough analysis, you've got the kind of data scientists in, you've got this kind of, not quite cast iron, but like very, very robust correlation analysis that says, hey, for every, 3 friends you connect with in 30 days or whatever, then XYZ, increase you'll get to the lifetime value of your users. So you start to get these rules that you can then set the team and say, hey, don't worry about revenue. If you move this metric, I know I get revenue as a product leader. So make sure you move this kind of activation metric or whatever it is.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is recruit either analysts or data scientists at your company or work with the leader of that function to say, hey, we need a project where we're either developing correlation matrices or we're working with strategic finance to actually build a financial model that will help us relate key input metrics that we think we want the team to focus on to output metrics.
Yeah, and I think this idea of having a model, like a mental model, a financial model, these are effectively the same things, right? So you start with a mental model that a PM should be able to come up with, an engineer should be able to come up with, right? Like, how does this thing that we're going to build, how does that deliver impact against the core business metrics? And then gradually you improve that model by making it data driven. And some of that transition or some of that upgrading that mental model to add in figures may be driven by analysts. Them saying like, hey, you've been assuming that, every 3 minutes faster we make our, customer response time. Actually, that leads to 30% greater LTV. Actually, it's more like 28% LTV now that we've done the analysis. Okay, great. So you can update your model, you can tweak it slightly, you're going to get better correlations, and that's no longer going to be an assumption. It's going to be backed by real evidence. That's the kind of thing that you're going to develop.
So you can build a model, and I think that model tends to work really well, especially looking backwards. But when you want to look forwards, I think a common antidote people try to work on is impact sizing, where they size the features before they actually ship them. I actually haven't seen any resources of you writing about this, or I tried to Google search like impact sizing on Hustle Badger and different things, and I hadn't seen you write about this. So what's your take on impact sizing?
Yeah, I think I write a bit about impact modeling, but not impact sizing. I'll have to add that keyword in. My take is this is a tool to help you think through what you're doing. And this is going to give you a rough estimate of the kind of impact that you might deliver. It is not a forecasting tool. So this is not going to tell you, build this thing, you're going to make $542,000, dollars worth of extra revenue this year, right? So the value comes through really thinking through in detail, what is your mental model for how you create impact? What is that narrative, right? Oh, if we do this, customers are going to like us more because we'll be producing more value. That means NPS will go up, word of mouth will go up, we'll get more new customers, our existing customers will stay for longer, and that will bring us more money. Great. Okay, that can be very simple. And then when you come to sort of saying like, okay, well, how big is the change going to be? That's a little more difficult, but there is some tricks you can use. So if you've built something similar, then obviously you can look at what was a similar thing that you built. Most of the time, that's not the case. But you might be able to look at it and say, hey, we've built 3 different features in the past year, each with completely different orders of magnitude. So we did this thing to the checkout funnel, and it gave us a 10% boost. And this thing gave us a 1% boost. And this one gave us if we're generous, a 0.1% boost. Okay, which of those do we think it's more likely to be? Okay, so you can sort of start to get a order of magnitude sense of, it's this one or that one. That's a subjective assessment, right? But it's going to be a better way of getting an answer or getting an estimate than saying like, well, I think it should be about 3%. What do you think? 4%? No one cares if it's 3 or 4%. You care if it's 1% or 10% or 100%. And I think there's 2 other ways that are quite useful to think about it as well. So if you look at your metrics, you're like, okay, we're going to affect conversion. How much is it going to move? 1%, 10%. Okay, look at what is your average user going through that funnel, your average kind of segment, and then what does your best cohort look like and your worst cohort look like? Because that's going to give you an indication of just how variable overall that metric is. If your best cohort is like 3 times better than your average cohort, you're not going to be able to take everyone to your best cohort. Like, that's not how it works. But you know that that's quite a variable metric that you could make substantial improvements to. If your best cohort is only like 2% better than your average cohorts, like you're kind of, it's going to be really difficult to move anything. Final way that I coach teams on this is to say, think about it the other way around. So you're thinking about a feature, you know roughly what it looks like. You've got this theory for how it might create impact. Roughly how much is this going to cost you to develop? It's going to take 2 months, give or take, and the team size is XYZ. It's $1 million a year. Great. So we've set our hurdle rate then. So if this was going to be a good feature to build, it would need to deliver X £100,000, X $100,000 dollars a year. Okay, for that to be true, we can then work back to the driver metrics with our model and say like, okay, well, that would have to generate at least this kind of impact. And very often when you do it that way round, you get to one of 2 things. You either get a sort of, hey, actually, we need to, do 10 times more impact than we've ever done in any feature. It's like, well, that's not going to happen. This is like, this is too ambitious. Or you get something that's like, well, like even if, uptake is 3% and it only increases their conversion rate like 0.1%, then probably it's still a good idea. And then you're like, okay, fine. Like let's just get on and do this because the numbers are gonna work. And then, obviously, like a whole bunch of times it's going to come out in that gray area, and you're not going to know at that point. You're just going to be like, well, it's in the mix somewhere. What are the other options we've got? Is this the only thing that we've got ideas to build, or if we've got some other ideas that might feel a bit more secure?
I think that hurdle one is for all the product leaders listening, really, really useful to do as like a portfolio review. Like you looking at all of your team's plans for the quarter, for instance, they've shared some with you and you're trying to figure out like, how do I add the best value? I think this calculation seems like one of the best ways because you'll be able to say, hey, this feature that you guys are thinking of building, well, it would need to outperform every other thing we've done in this space to have the proper ROI. Do we actually think it can get there?
Yeah, and that's a really simple thing you can do is you can just say to your teams like, hey, I want every PRD to have an impact sizing on it, an impact estimate. And when you do that, the critical assumptions, I don't care what you put in there, just put like 2-3 bullet points about how you came to that assumption. And they'll give you like, well, we decided to give it 5% because last quarter we shipped this thing and that was 5%. Great, that seems sensible. Or whatever it is, like that level of reasoning is already like a massive step up from what most product teams are doing in my experience.
Okay, so impact sizing might not exist on the Hustle Badger site. It will by this time this episode releases, and impact modeling really should be a part of PRDs.
Absolutely.
Okay, got it. And if somebody is struggling, because I feel like this is the one that I get the most, even senior PMs pinging me on, like struggling, like I can't even think of a feature last year that was in a similar space. Like, what are sort of the go-to back pocket techniques if you just need to put something there for that section in your PRD?
Yeah, if you need to do something, then I'd go for, there's 2 things I'd try. So one thing is I'd look at the difference between your average cohort and your best cohorts. And I just look at how variable is that metric, because that should give you a sense of how much can you move that metric anyway. Like you're never going to take everyone from being average to being amazing, but you'll get them some of the way. And the other technique I'd look at is just reversing it. So look at the hurdle rate and say, okay, for this feature to be worth building, we need to deliver 20% more than the cost of building it. Cost of building it is going to be 2 months, so it's $300,000 or whatever it is. Therefore, conversion rate needs to be 4% or more. Okay, does that seem reasonable? Just gut feel, does that seem reasonable? Right, so those are the 2 ways I'd say, like if you've got no comparables, you should have those 2 ways to look at it.
Cool. And then the other way I try to recommend to people is sort of this addressable population sizing. So I'll give like a really tactical example. At a firm, we're building a new feature for lending. So we needed to think about, well, what is the addressable population? How many people will actually be eligible out of our user group? Out of those eligible people, how many typically take us up on a lending program? Okay, so now we have this addressable population where it's not even 100% of users. It's like 7% of users. What is the lift we're going to need against that cost basis that we just talked about on that 7% of users to justify this feature?
Yeah, and like that's why I like using RICE over ICE. What's the difference? Well, RICE, you've got that reach figure, right, the R, and you're saying impact is on a per user basis, and then you're kind of taking reach out of that. Why take reach out of it? Reach is probably the most certain number in those 4 figures, like reach, impact, confidence, effort. Reach is the one, you're designing the feature for a particular audience. So it's going to hit 100% of your users, or it's going to hit 100% of your new users, or it's only going to hit your power users who happen to be 23% of your audience, right? That is going to be super confident. Your confidence number, that is a subjective estimate, but you can calibrate it on your confidence meter, which you've taken it to Mars one, or you just created your one internally. And your effort is probably going to be, correct, plus or minus 50%, which is pretty good. Your impact one is the one that is like really could be anywhere. And that's the one where I think, can you get order of magnitude sizing on this? That's what you're looking for. Getting more precise than that's going to be super tricky. Or going to be, it's that input into that kind of market sizing question. It's like, where do you even start with that? That's the challenge.
That's fascinating. I actually haven't heard someone with that take, but it makes a lot of sense, which is like reach. We have so much more confidence in that R out of the RICE. So I'm pretty familiar with ICE scoring where, you do like impact times confidence. over effort. If you add reach in, what does the formula look like?
So it's reach times impact times confidence over effort. So effectively,
Got it.
Yeah, you're just taking impact and saying, like, what is the impact of this feature? And that's on a company level, on a product level. And you're turning that impact to saying, defining it slightly differently and saying, like, what is the impact on a per user basis?
Okay. And so all those metrics need to be standardized to like 0 to 1 to make the formula work? Or what is sort of the unit for each of those 4 metrics?
It doesn't matter as long as you're using a consistent scale between the things that you're comparing, because you're generally going to come out with a arbitrary figure, 53,623, and it doesn't matter what matters is it bigger or smaller than the other numbers. And the other thing that I kind of coach teams on, same for effort, right, is, you speak to short analysts, they'll say, oh, you just scale these on 1 to 10, you just do it super quickly. It's just meant to be a sort of like gut prioritization. Like, okay, great, but I'd prefer to do that on a Fibonacci scale or logarithmic scale, because the most impactful features don't have 10 times more impact than the least impactful features. So like the difference between 1 and 10 on that scale is not big enough. The biggest features have like 1,000 times more impact than the least impactful features. And similarly, some things can get built in an afternoon and some things take 3 months to build. And the difference between that is not 1 to 10. It's like 1 to 100. So think about what is your scales to reflect accurately that sort of logarithmic nature of the best outcomes from the worst outcomes.
Can you say just a little bit more about the logarithmic nature if people don't follow?
Yeah. So if I'm on the effort one, it's a bit easier to explain. So on effort, I might define something that's going to take a day or less as being like a 1 on the effort scale, right? And even if it's going to be 2 minutes, sure, testing, release, yada, yada. Okay. If it's going to take less than a week, I might then call that a 4 on the scale. So, and if it's going to take less than a month, I might call that then a 15 on the scale. So my scale is not going 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going 1, 4, 15, because I'm saying like, okay, I've come up with 4 because I'm saying like, well, it's going to be less than a week. Let's say on average it's 4 days, and the days are anything less than a month, we're going to score as 15. Why 15? Because that's 3 weeks. So maybe that's right for like less than a month, or maybe you call it 20 because there's 20 working days in a month, right? But the point is you've got, when you look at your kind of 1, 4, 15, you've got a much more accurate representation of how long things are going to take than you do when you're using a linear scale, 1, 2, 3. And similarly on a impact scale, I might score that, okay, is this a 1, is this a 10, is this at 100? Rather than is this a 1, 2, 3 and impact.
So you have this quote that progress is inversely proportional to the number of priorities we have, and I love it. Explain.
Yeah, so for me, this came from, it's just simple maths, right? If you have 1 priority, you spend 100% of your time on that. If you have 4 priorities, then the maximum or the average time you're going to spend on those things is 1 over 4. It's 25% of your time on each one of those things. So the progress that you're going to make on any one of those initiatives is going to be inversely proportional to how many initiatives you've got. It's actually a little bit worse than that because, of course, you've got switching costs. So every time you add a new initiative, you're not only decreasing the amount of time you've got to share between your initiatives, but you're also introducing this sort of dead time switching cost that is not used in productive work.
Okay, so does that mean that we need to simplify our priorities? Like, should everyone just have 1 priority at any given time?
When I run my product teams, I tell them they should have 1 priority per quarter. And usually there's a bit of a fudge because they have like 1 sort of strategic priority and they have 1, tech strategy, tech debt priority. But yeah, I try and have teams with just 1 priority at a time.
And what is the priority? Is that a problem? Is that a metric? Is that one big feature?
It will vary depending on the team, but it will be 1 sort of main work stream. And ideally that's sort of articulated with a purpose for the team, a kind of qualitative, inspiring kind of objective, and then some kind of metric, which is a quantitative measure of how much progress they've made towards that purpose or that mission.
Okay, reflecting back on my teams, I feel like sometimes I probably gave some teams like 4 or 5 priorities and they made like 80% progress against it. So I think now I'm realizing like maybe some of the errors, like if you give them one, then potentially they actually have the ability to exceed that by more than 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I think I really dislike OKRs done in the sense when, you have 3 different objectives and each of those objectives have 5 key results and you end up with 15 key results for a team. It's like, if you go and ask someone on that team what they're meant to be doing, they're going to give you word salad. They're going to give you like some long-winded description, which the only thing it tells you is they don't really know what they're meant to be doing. And if you have one metric, one objective, the main benefit, the major benefit is you go and ask anyone on that team what they're doing. They'll be able to tell you exactly what they're doing and exactly how it's measured. And that is very, very powerful.
The future of marketing is word of mouth. Turn your users and partners into your most valuable growth channel with podcast partner Cello. Cello is the only all-in-one solution to engage your most passionate users and partners to refer your product with just a few clicks. Best of all, Cello is directly embedded into your product and handles everything from referral payments to tax and compliance. And it runs on autopilot, so you can focus on scaling and building your own product. Here's how it works. First, within just a few hours, Cello integrates with your product and existing tools to automate all manual work. In your dashboard, you can then set up your referral campaign, define the reward details, and make the referral experience your own. After the program goes live, Cello continuously analyzes and scales its performance based on AI-generated recommendations. Plus, you only pay for successful. Go give it a try for free and learn more about user-led growth at cello.so/product growth. Yeah, on like a psychology level, I feel like it really takes advantage of your background processing too. If you're like focusing on 5 things, it's very hard to just background process on all 5 of them. But if you're focusing on one thing, you can really just excel at that one thing because kind of the way our whole human system works, it feels like you can recruit all your resources.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to think about it in the shower. You're going to think about it on, your way home. Like, you like it or not, you're sort of like, it's going to keep you up at night. I mean, that's not the design of like trying to keep my teams up at night, but it just provides that kind of clarity of purpose that I think gives you the best results.
Okay. Another element of strategy that I really like of yours is this concept of a snap strategy. And I really do credit that to you because I hadn't seen so many people popularize it. This was the subject of that newsletter post that we mentioned with 255 likes. What is a snap strategy and how can someone build one?
Yeah, I should really credit Gibson Biddle at this point because he talks about having what he calls a swag, which is a stupid, wild ass guess. And it's his effective, his snap strategies. But the idea here is that pretty much as soon as you can, you want to write down your thoughts, your understanding of what the strategy is and build from that. When I say as soon as possible, like if you're interviewing for a new role, you're probably writing the snap strategy during the interview process, not 2 weeks after you've started the new job. Right? It's probably part of the interview process to come up with that first view of like what you should be doing. And why is that powerful? Or what does that look like firstly? So what does that look like? Again, I think about what is the objective here? What is the problem you're trying to solve? How do you define that qualitatively? So how do you describe it? How do you define it quantitatively? Like how are you going to measure whether you're making any progress? Then you're going to have some understanding of who your users are, what their needs are, what are your superpowers, what are the things that only you can do, what are the unique benefits that you can offer? And then you're going to get into, okay, if that's the value we're trying to deliver, what are the main themes of work? What are the main work streams? What are the main pillars? Whatever you want to call them, that then help us get from where we are now to where we want to be. And under each of those pillars, what sorts of things might we build? Why? So that writing all that down, probably you're looking at like 1 to 3 pages. It's probably going to take you your first draft an hour or two. It really does not need to take a lot of time because you're not going and doing research to write that. You're writing that from what you already understand and what is already in your head. And the benefit of doing that is that writing it is going to help you pull your own thoughts together, firstly. Secondly, you've then got something you can go and show to other people. Other people are going to be able to comment on it. They're particularly going to want to comment on it if they disagree with you. And you should see those disagreements as opportunities to learn, not as mistakes that you've made. So it generates new insights. It kind of makes you aware of new perspectives because it forces them out of other people. It also, in combination, those two things, so getting your thinking straight and pulling insights out of other people, is going to highlight areas where your thinking is a bit weaker. You just don't have the evidence base. And you're saying like, hey, we're going to go and build these things. Why do I think that? I don't really know. It kind of feels right. Great. That is actually also powerful because that then says, okay, we've got a big risk here. We've got a big assumption. That's an area we should go and focus our discovery on. We're going to go and tackle the biggest risks up first, of course. So it helps guide your discovery. And I think the final reason I like those things is they tend to be much better than you think. You think if you write a strategy in like 1 hour, it's going to be garbage. And actually what you find is it's probably 80% of what you'd write if you took a week over it, which is probably itself 80% of what you would take, a month over it. In my first job at McKinsey, every client project we did, we would write our day one answer as the first thing we did. And this is the same principle. You write your hypothesis of what is the answer, and then you can be hypothesis driven about proving all of the things that need to be true for that answer to be true. If you find something, a piece of evidence that disproves that hypothesis, that is not a bad thing. That's great. You're learning. You rewrite it immediately, bearing in mind the new evidence, and you keep on going.
As a founder now, what always struck me is that those things were so gosh darn right. Like I would write those things in the interview and then that would just be my job for the next few years. Like you said, of course, we'll learn new things along the way. We'll test hypotheses. We'll reduce risks. But putting on that founder hat again, like because those things tend to be like 90% right, do we kind of overhype the risk reduction and do we kind of overhype strategy work? Like maybe should strategy work not be like, 80-90% of what a PM is spending time on, or the average PMs maybe spending a little bit too much time on this if we can write something that's 80-90% correct in just a few hours?
I think the problem is that strategy takes a lot of time if you are trying to fit everyone's suggestions into some kind of framework. If you're trying to cover all the bases, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time just to assess all those ideas and gather evidence for them and research whether they, how they should be done. If you see strategy as really articulating what is the focus and being, laser focused on doing high impact things, then actually it doesn't need to take very long. It can be highly effective, but it's also not what most PMs are doing.
Okay. So there is a balance really. And double clicking on the point around using it to guide you, maybe you can explain more about this McKinsey method, because I think there's something to learn there for PMs. Like, how do you, maybe people comment on a certain area, that's like obvious, but how do you kind of take the question marks in your SNAP strategy and then use that as your roadmap for discovery?
So a SNAP strategy, let's try and come up with an example here. So when I was CPO at FutureLearn, we had some hypotheses about what were the reasons our users were learning. And we had some hypotheses about what were the marketing channels they came through. And as a result, that gave us a whole bunch of hypotheses about which marketing channels we should invest in, what our marketing messages should be. And those are obviously supported by product, which is how I came involved in it. And we could then basically write that out, in an afternoon. I think I said, Susanna was COO. So my co-founder currently was working with me at FutureLearn as well. And we regularly just have working sessions to kind of thrash these sorts of things out. But we do it sort of like from what we knew in general. And then having written it down, we go and check that what we'd written down was actually true. So we go and check that the marketing channels we thought were the major ones. And we go and check that actually, most of our customers did touch email if we thought that was an important channel. And we'd go and check that what was coming up in user research were the reasons that we'd written down, right? So you go and evidence everything after you've written down the narrative. And if you discover that the evidence actually contradicts your narrative rather than supports it, then you need to update your narrative. Be like, okay, wait a second, they're not coming from this reason, they're coming from this other reason. What else does that change in the narrative? But usually you can do that fairly quickly. You can do that again, like half a day or something. And that will then spring up another bunch of hypotheses or kind of assumptions that you go and test. So yeah, you're really looking at how do you evidence your argument? How would you convince someone else with good reasons?
I think this is a really good template for everyone listening. I feel like the average PM, even product leader that I worked with, the way they would approach strategy is they would come up with, okay, these are the things we need to know. Hey, team, go work on them. Let's go work on them. All right. Our strategy review is in a week. I'm just going to dedicate this whole week to writing this thing, and I'm going to be in a black box, and I'm just going to make an amazing document, and I'm going to produce it and share it out. That's really the anti-pattern. With the snap strategy approach, you're flipping that on its head. You're taking the McKinsey model where I'm going to write it out. I might write out the snap strategy well before the strategic planning process at our company comes up. And that's going to help me identify for the next quarter even, what are the evidence areas where we need to shore up our evidence? What are the areas that as a team we're not as confident? And then when it comes time to that 1 week strategy planning, it's just a matter of updating what snap strategy you had or maybe rewriting it for all the things you've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you work in that classic kind of bottom-up way which you were describing, this is where you get the sort of cliche. You point in the ocean, you've got analysis paralysis. You're doing all this stuff, all this work, which feels like it's productive, but actually most of the analysis that you do is not going to be valuable. It's not going to be insightful, and therefore it's a waste of time. So when you write the narrative first and you say, okay, for this narrative to be true, I need to go and hunt down these facts. You've got very, very specific questions that you need to get answers to. And if it's, you get the data, it goes straight into your strategy deck. You get a, contradictory result. That is interesting. So like every piece of analysis you do is super high impact in terms of what you learn. Whereas you're going to say, oh, we really need to understand our users. You're suddenly like, okay, well, what am I going to ask them? And how many of them am I going to ask? And doesn't matter between, there's just a million questions you could ask them, and you can spend a huge amount of time going around in circles, sort of, not knowing what is the direction to head in.
Yeah, I think this is the manifestation of the advice of treat your strategy kind of like a product. As a product manager, you're not just going to sit in obscurity and build in stealth for 3 months and then unveil to the users, right? We're going to put it out there. We're going to start to get some feedback. And I view the snap strategy to final strategy process as kind of similar. You're putting it out there, but the users might be your stakeholders. They might be your cross-functional partners in different teams. And those people are giving you the signal around, okay, we need to adjust this, we need to tweak that. And I think that's how you get to those McKinsey decks. If anyone's ever seen a McKinsey deck, they're crazy. When you look at them, you're just like, wow, every slide is filled with data. Every slide is clearly backed up. The way you get there is by first starting from, this is the final answer and these are our gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's generally a great metaphor for anything you touch as a product manager. Think of it as a product. Think of your strategy as a product. Think of your career as a product. You can think of anything as a product, and it's usually the best way to start.
100%. So we've got this strategy. It sounds like it might be a doc at first. It might evolve into a little bit of a deck. Say more about that. What are your go-to tactics for getting stakeholder buy-in? A lot of people, it's easy to get buy-in amongst their team, but when they go out to sales or they go out to product marketing or they go out to their CEO, all of a sudden there's way more resistance coming in.
Yeah. So your strategy, what is the success criteria over that? The success of your strategy is, do people go and work on high impact things? And do they work in a aligned way? Okay, great. So what do you need for people to work in a high impact aligned way? You need to give them really clear guidelines, context, expectations. That's usually, I found, like easiest to get going with just a written Word doc, because you just get going. You don't worry about the visuals or the layout or anything. You just start typing. And then you start breaking it down into sections and so on. At some point, if you're going to then present that to the whole company, you're going to present that to a board, you probably want to make that a little bit more visual. You're going to have your storyline, your narrative is then going to be straight. It's going to be like worked out in the written document, and you're going to be able to cut a lot of words by showing one or two charts. So you can make it more visual, easier for people to understand. So either of those two ways, it's usually kind of a bit of a transition. First a written doc, and then at some point it should become slides for me.
Okay. And we had Ravi Mehta on the podcast last month, and his whole point of view was the best strategies he'd built. He cited, for instance, a strategy that was really successful when he was a VP of Product at TripAdvisor, had tons of visuals, not just charts like you just mentioned, but actual wireframes, actual design explorations. What's your take on visuals?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I saw this in the show notes, and I completely agreed. So I usually include that as one of the steps in even a snap strategy and certainly a kind of full blown strategy. Is that's what I'd call the product vision. And I like different people call it different things, but that's the visuals for me. It's this kind of vision type idea, this sort of cross between a prototype or a storyboard or just a series of mock-ups, but it really brings to life what is the future you're trying to build. And that is super powerful at aligning people and make sure they're heading in the right direction, but also inspiring them, because people get really excited by the visuals and they see like, oh yeah, we're going to build this thing and it's going to be super cool. It just becomes more alive for them. So yeah, I'm very, very pro.
Okay. And in the context of our earlier discussion around full-stack PMs and roles and responsibilities, in the mainstream way of doing things, what is sort of the right process for tackling these visuals? I imagine it means you're actually having your designer help with those. So how do you bring them in? How much time should they be spending? Like, should they just have like a couple sprints, like 2 sprints, maybe a quarter, where they're working on the strategic vision and those visuals? Or how should we think about bringing our design partner along for building this strategy?
Yeah, this is something you can do iteratively as well. So you don't need to say, oh, we need 2 weeks for this. Oh, we need 2 months for this. Like, the way that I think about it is start with the customer journey, understand what the current customer journey is, and then think through what the ideal customer journey is. Then, if your customer journey, as is, you've got screenshots for what your product looks like, your future one, your ideal state, you should be able to create storyboards or mock-ups for each of those steps. Same way. And then a really good format that I've used before is a kind of like, this is where we are now, this is where we're going to be in the future. You've got a kind of before and after visuals you can share with people. And those visuals, yes, you're probably going to rely on your design partner to come up with something there, but you can do that in very different ways. Probably the lowest budget way, or the lowest effort way, is to write a few bullet points or go and get screenshots of other products that you're using as references. And I've used that before. It's like, oh, we need to build trust and safety features. And you know what? Here's a screenshot and some call outs for what Airbnb is doing. And here's some stuff that Monzo is doing, or whoever it is, right? So you're kind of pulling out references. That's very, very, you could do that in a couple of hours. If you've got design time, great, get them to go and do some wireframes. If they've got a bit more time, get them to go and do, high fidelity visuals like mock-ups. Great. If they've got even more time, get them to go and create a prototype. Like, there's a sliding scale there of effort. It doesn't need to be a sort of, all or nothing approach. It depends what else you've got on your team and how much time you've got before you need to show this to anyone.
Mm-hmm. And what is state of the art? Like, let's say that I'm a VP of product. We have like pretty good, 10, 15 product teams. I've seen this model, and this is what Shake did at Apollo, where he took one of the designers who really understood kind of the whole product, and he basically worked like a whole month with them on this. Do you think that's a reasonable approach, or what is kind of like the best case scenario if you're well resourced?
Yeah, I mean, again, the best case is the one that most clearly articulates that vision to everyone else that it needs to. It's that, the proof is in the pudding. The ends justify the results. So who are some good examples of this? If you search for SpaceX's vision on YouTube, they've got a video about how they're going to take, people to Mars. And that is really inspiring. It's very clear what they're going to do. And I love it. You search for, great, not everyone's taking people to Mars. So if you search for Asana on YouTube, again, they've got a video as well, which has some people talking and some people working together, and it intersperses those with some slightly abstract or slightly, idealized visuals. But again, it's very clear kind of the themes of work and the kinds of interactions that they're expecting people to have on Asana. So I think that's very good. What has worked really well for me, there's probably two different things that work really well for me. Like one is the sort of before and after version. Hey, here's a screenshot of our home screen, and this is what it's going to look like in the future. And just picking, 4 or 5 key screens in the product and looking at the change between them. That's worked really well for me in the past. And the other way is the storyboard, which is, sort of every screen people are going to touch, or, all the important screens people are going to touch in their user journey. What does that look like when we've, in the future, when we've made it better? They're both really visual. People both kind of get going. And I think that is kind of state of the art, right? You just got that real clear, like, this is the future that we're building, and this is why you should be excited, and why customers are going to be excited.
Awesome. I'm going to look up those Asana and SpaceX examples and drop them in the description. So that's strategy. I think product leadership more broadly is where I want to move to now, because you have this really cool quote. PMs work on the product. Product leaders work on the product org. Can you say more?
Yeah. When you're a product manager, you're working on building a better digital product, right? You work with designers, you work with engineers, you come up with designs, you write code, and you ship things, and that is how you deliver impact. And when you become a product leader, so you are managing other PMs, you're not working directly with designers and engineers to write code and ship product. You're working indirectly with, PMs and designers and engineers to write code. And that means that, you don't go and do the analysis for your PMs. You don't go and write the strategy for them, right? You get better results because you build a better organization, and that has multiple components to it. And I think there's kind of 3 core components in general, right? Like, firstly is this kind of strategy side. What should we go and build? You've got to be providing the right level of context and direction. The second element is the execution side. So how are we going to build that? Do we have the processes and tooling in place to build things effectively? And the third one is the people, right? Who is going to build this? Do we have the right people and the right roles and the right ways of working? And so as a product leader, you're not going and doing the user research yourself. You're thinking about, hey, if my teams are going to work effectively, what kind of PMs do I need to hire? And how do I design the hiring process that I get those kinds of PMs? Or, if I'm going to provide them really good feedback and challenge them in their designs, what kind of product reviews do we need to be running? And how are we going to run those with which stakeholders? And what are the pre-reads going to be? So all of your thinking is kind of raised up a level. You're thinking on an organizational level rather than on a, in the details of the product building the code itself.
Got it. And We've seen this push, I think, recently, especially since the layoffs that happened in 2021 and 2022, for product leaders not just to focus on the product org, to get back into the details, to start, commenting the heck out of the Figmas, commenting the heck out of the PRDs, actually jumping in and looking at QAs before features go live on top of the product reviews. What are your thoughts on that general trend of having product leaders do a little bit more IC work?
I think this really depends on the context again, because this was once described to me, the analogy was you're flying a plane. So what does a pilot need to fly a plane? Well, they need instruments, right? They need to know their altitude. They need to know their airspeed. They need to know their heading. And they need controls. They need to be able to increase the throttle or change the flaps and, put the landing gear down. And if they have those two things, they can fly the plane. And as a product leader, you need both of those. So you need your instruments. You need signals coming out of the product organization about how well it is performing. And you need control levers. You need ways of changing how the product organization works to increase its performance. Now, often, I would say that is improved by having a really good knowledge of the customers and the product itself and being able to dive into the details where necessary. But I think you also need to recognize that if you are the apex of the product pyramid, like you're the one person running the product team, you're in a privileged position in the sense that you have context and information and visibility that no one else in the organization has. And to ignore that or not act on that is not taking full advantage of your position. And you're not taking advantage of the leverage that you have to make changes across the whole organization. So do you need that context? Do you need that visibility in the details? You definitely need some. Otherwise, how are you going to be able to make good decisions, and how are you going to have context? But you clearly cannot spend as much time as the ICs would do. You cannot, if you are going to be an expert in any area, that is a real problem, because it means that your ICs are not enough into the detail, because you will be doing other things or have a broader remit as well.
Okay, got it. And you mentioned a couple different factors there, like what PMs, what processes, and the organization. I want to double click on each of these one at a time. So starting with what PMs, I feel like this is something that there's very little guidance or context on. It just tends to be transmitted generationally or via experience. But how should a product leader really be thinking about, maybe we're going to open up a new product manager spot, or maybe somebody has left and we're filling in a new product manager spot? These are sort of the decision vectors I should be thinking about, whether it's level or domain industry experience. Like, what are those vectors that you would focus on them making a deliberate choice around? Yeah.
I mean, that you're selecting someone who you want to be successful in roles. So who you select depends on the role. So almost always I find people that are good product managers are smart, they are empathetic, they are data informed. There are some of these kind of classic things, but beyond that, there are some things that are more context specific. So if you're going to have someone who's building an internal platform in a really big organization, having someone who's done that before and knows some of the known problems, that is going to be useful. It's probably not critical, but it might be useful. And they probably need to be excited by that kind of work, which some people will find really interesting and empowering, and other people, it just won't be their thing. But overall, I think I always look for people who have that intellectual horsepower, and particularly I use, do they understand the numbers as a way of testing that? Because that's, for me, being a really effective filter as a first kind of point of call of like, are they going to be able to kind of synthesize large amounts of data, understand it, and therefore make good decisions?
Okay. And I've been working with a lot of job seekers recently, and the consistent thing I hear is, oh, I made it to final round, but the feedback I got was they found someone with more industry experience, or they found someone with more functional experience. So it seems to be like a trend almost in product management that hiring managers are really anchoring in on one of those. Like you said, if they're a big internal platform project, have they done that? Or even more common nowadays, like at Apollo, I was in sales tech. We really wanted to hire people with sales tech backgrounds. What do you think about those trends of moving towards domain and functional expertise? Are those good things, and should product leaders lean into them?
I think generally functional expertise, industry expertise, I'd put these fairly low on my list of priorities. So, I'd put these, maybe 7 or 8 on my list of priorities. So these are not things that I'm actively selecting for, because I'm selecting for things like, have they got good quantitative analysis? Are they good at structuring their thoughts? Are they good at communicating and being empathetic with other people? These are like much more important for me. And I find that industry experience and sector, functional experience they're useful, but they're not critical. A lot of stakeholders that I work with, a lot of CEOs, salespeople, they're much more bullish on the industry experience. So that's often something where you have to come to some kind of understanding or accommodation about how you're going to hire your team, or what are the expectations. And it should be said, like for like, if you've got 2 people who are otherwise completely the same, but one has done this sort of thing for 3 years already, that person is going to, they're going to be better. They're going to have made a bunch of mistakes already. They're going to have picked a lot of stuff up. They are going to be more effective, most likely, in role than someone who's never done it before.
Got it. So it is an important criteria, but it's not like you have to first have equality on those first 6 factors before you're using it as a selection criteria.
Exactly.
Okay. The second element you talked about were some of the processes. For instance, what are the PRD templates? When do you have product reviews? And product reviews is the one that I feel like people they're very nervous about. And product leaders themselves, they're stepping back. Maybe they have too many product reviews and they're removing them, or they don't have any product reviews and they're adding them. But there seems to be a lack of guidance or best practice out there. How should people be thinking about the product review process?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because there is so much variability about how teams work in this space. And if given the time, the way I would think about this is get the team together and get them to, again, workshop out what do they understand is the product development process. So I often use the kind of classic double diamond one. You've got how do you define the problem? How do you select which problem it is? How do you then brainstorm different solutions and so on? But whatever your process is, you're going to go through some kind of set of stages where you move from being set a business objective through to releasing features and delivering results. And there's going to be a bunch of things that happen in between: discovery and coding and design and these sorts of things. As a team, work out what are those steps. Again, most important thing here is that this is your shared understanding. And then for each of those steps, you're not trying to write a checklist or a manual of this is all the things you're trying to do. You're trying to maximize the context that you have for each of those steps. So what are we calling this step? Description, what are we expecting is going to happen here? Why do we do this step? What is the benefits of it? What are the outputs of it? Who else is involved? Are there any examples or templates of people who've done this well? And then right at the bottom of that list is probably going to be is there a check-in outside the team? That could be a product review. That could be a milestone review, a status update, whatever you want to call it. But do you need to check with anyone else before you move to the next stage of development? And often I find these things happen at certain phases in development. So they happen when you're starting to build a new feature. It's a kind of kickoff phase. They happen when you have designed a feature, but before you started coding it. It's a kind of design review. Are we really clear on what we're building here? They happen just before you launch. You have a kind of launch review type of process, or they happen after you've launched it and you review what the results were. So some of these periods just naturally come up. Again, there are kind of patterns you have there. But again, what's important is that you kind of identify, when should we be talking to other people? And is that communication, is that a discussion? Is that we're just sending them an update? Like if we're having a discussion, what kinds of things are we discussing? You can start to define some of these things for your organization. And then you go through and you say, okay, well, we've got these kinds of meetings. This is roughly how often they're going to come up. So do we start batching some of these conversations together and call that a product review? That for me would be the ideal way of doing it. Like sometimes you're going to have to go, you might want to just start putting some product reviews in. But again, like if you're going to just do that, just think about, why are we having these meetings? What is the value we're hoping to get out of them? And then based on that value, that output that we want to get out of the meetings, who needs to be there? What is the format?
Okay. And what are the highest leverage ones as a product leader? If I reflect back on my career, I feel like I was able to give some of the best direction that didn't come too late on the design review for big features. But if I also reflect back on my career, I feel like those didn't always happen. A lot of times the team was busy, or the designer was only given like a week before they had to code it, and they finally finish on Friday, and so there's no time for a design reviewer in 8 iterations. Is that one of those high leverage points, and should people be building in time for that?
It certainly is a high leverage point. I think as a product leader, it's also the most fun to be involved in, which is not the same thing, but I always love it when I get to go to those kind of design reviews and, you know, chip in my 2 cents before they actually start building things. I actually think, you know, if you're purely talking about what was the highest leverage points, then the kickoff and the impact review would be the highest leverage ones. The kickoff, like being really clear that the team has thought through, you know, what is the objective, you know, what's the problem they're trying to solve, and how are they going to measure that, and who else needs to be involved, the constraints and all that kind of stuff. Because so often you get teams who are like, oh, we need to build this thing because so-and-so said we need to build this thing. And they don't have a clue about really what they're building or why. And the impact review then, after you shipped it, checking back, did it do what you expected it to do? Because that's something where so many teams just, you know, fire and forget, ship stuff and move on. And if you're doing that, how can you possibly be learning? How can you be increasing your understanding of your customers and what makes your business grow? You can't be. So in that case, just having the meeting drives accountability. It makes sure that people do actually look at the numbers. They do actually learn stuff, and they do feed those learnings back into their next piece of work.
That's a fascinating insight, because if I look back on my career, I don't think that I actually had an impact review anywhere I worked. It was generally just a doc sent out. So I didn't see like the lack of discipline on measuring, but I rarely saw a meeting. So how should you run that meeting?
The way I've seen this before, and again, like you could do it asynchronously if you had good enough discipline. I think a lot of these things you can run asynchronously. The real-time meetings are good for building team culture and having discussions and so on. We had a great one of these at Wooga, effectively, where every week we'd have an A/B test meeting where all the PMs on one game would get together, and we'd probably have half a dozen to a dozen A/B tests running at one time, and we just run through each one in turn. And we'd look at the numbers, and we'd look at the significance coming out of the calculators and this. We'd have a bit of a chat, because always the, you know, competing numbers on these things. And we just have a discussion between the 3 or 4 of us about, like, okay, do we run this for longer? Do we roll it out? Do we roll it back? And we have a 5-minute, 10-minute discussion, and then the product lead would make a decision, and we'd move on to the next one. And I think that was powerful. You know, it was fast. Everyone who joined the team got up to speed really quickly on how we thought and what were the signals that we cared about. And it also kind of removed that bias of someone taking some kind of maverick position and, you know, not being challenged by anyone else.
I like that. Yeah. It's like this idea of like either a weekly or a biweekly sort of A/B test review. And I feel like one of the things it could avoid, which is a problem I saw a couple times, is a team might graduate a feature, but they don't have the context that the product leader had about a certain guardrail metric, and they failed to check it. Or if they checked it, they didn't like wait till it got to significance.
Yeah, exactly. And I think product leaders as well, they can be very annoying as product managers, because they'd be like, oh yeah, but actually this other team did this other thing, and therefore XYZ, and they kind of change the whole framing of things. And that's annoying if you're in the team, because you're like, well, we didn't know that. It's like, yeah, of course you didn't know that. That's the whole point, is that you're bringing in people who have this kind of broader perspective, so that you can have someone kind of provide that context and check that, whilst you're focused on your little patch and you're the expert on that, you are actually taking into account the bigger picture as well.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about who you hire, some of the processes specifically around product reviews. And then the final component was, what is the actual organization? What are these teams focused on? How do you organize them? And how frequently do you reorganize them? And I tend to see that there are basically 2 or 3 main ways people organize teams. So the most common way that probably 80% of teams are organized is how they've seen it done in the past. So, my SaaS company, we had core product teams and we had these growth PMs. So that's how we'll do it here. The second way I tend to see is based on core feature areas that people want to work on. And then the third way, which is I think the most radical and probably the most rare because it requires full stack engineers, is based on the goals or metric areas that you want to move. Is that a fair representation of kind of the taxonomy of options you have for organizing a team? Or how should a product leader be thinking about, these are my choices A, B, C that I should be thinking between?
Yeah, there's probably a couple more that I'd add in there. So sometimes you see it done by user persona, so particularly in marketplaces. You might get a supply side and demand side teams. We might have growth teams sort of sitting across things. And you also sometimes just get a product surface area type of team. So, we have a homepage team and a search results team and a product page team and a checkout team, and these all have their advantages and limitations. I really like the one where you have teams assigned to goals, because it goes back to what we were talking about, that product is an investment. It's a technology investment on the part of the company. And as a product leader, you're not solving the problems yourself. You're not going in and speaking to the customers because you're working at the organization level. So your resource allocation, how do you define your teams and which problems do you set them against? That is how you articulate your strategy. And so if you choose any other way of organizing your teams, you have to do that translation, saying, hey, we're going to have these teams, but our strategy is these pillars, and those don't line up. So how does that work?
They very rarely line up, is my experience. And in fact, what ends up happening is that the momentum of whatever was there before ends up kind of acting as glue, because you'll have engineering managers and engineers that have learned a specific code base. And I know that everybody listening has felt the pain of a reorg, and they know what reorging too much is. But is there also such a thing as reorging too little?
I think it's less in the reorging too little. I know what you mean. You're sort of saying you end up with a team that's working on internal tooling, and really there's no kind of business value there in the sense of it's not going to change the P&L. It's not going to give you more customers. It's not going to reduce the cost base. But there's a bunch of internal stakeholders who are like, but we need this button on the admin board, and we need this automation. And if there's no team there who's going to do all that stuff, and the correct answer is well, either you put a value on those things and you recognize the value that team is doing, or you don't have that team. You have some team is going to cover critical bugs, but there will be no development on that product.
Okay. So those are the 3 elements of leadership, a brief tour. What advice do you give most frequently to PMs transitioning into these leadership roles?
I think the first thing I do is I warn people that this is a really major career transition. You are doing a fundamentally different role, and that is going to require a whole new set of skills. Because as an individual contributor, as a PM working in a team with designers and engineers, you are speaking to customers, you are writing PRDs, you're writing strategy docs, you're chatting with the designers and so on. And eventually you become good at that. You can deliver results with it. And when you become a manager, you can't do any of those things. Like, the only thing you can do really is you can go and chat to the PMs, and you can provide them context, and you can provide them examples, and you can coach them. And any result, any business result you deliver will be done indirectly through the people reporting into you. So that's a very different way of working. And that, I think, is the first point to get across, is just to be like, hey, this is going to be very different. So don't assume that anything that you know is going to work in this new world. And then, I mean, there are lots of things you can say, but I think there's probably two things I emphasize more than anything else. I think setting clear expectations is really, really important. So expectations I mean by like, what are we expecting out of this work stream? What are we expecting our PRDs to look like? What is the quality that we expect, documents and things to be done as? Like, just the more context and examples and case studies you can provide to people, the easier it is for them to understand what they're meant to be doing. And the second thing I emphasize, and maybe like a reflection of me, is like, you've got to have really high standards. And I think my natural tendency is perhaps to be a little too nice to people and not be direct enough about the quality bar that I want. And lots of people have that, right? It's the kind of classic, very kind, not direct enough quadrant of radical candor. It's the ruinous empathy or whatever it is. And so really pushing people to be like, no. Like, the more senior you get, the tougher you have to be. You've got to be super clear what is the quality bar, and that quality bar has to be high.
And it's so easy to just say, like, good job with that PRD, good job with that product review. And you also want them to like review you positively. So you kind of just default back to being nice. What are the actual tactics that you do to remind yourself, like, to keep the standards high?
I think, again, just having a very clear expectation of what good looks like. And particularly, if you can communicate that in advance, that makes things way easier. Because if you can say, like, hey, my expectations for this quarterly planning process is you come back with some OKRs and they're going to look like this. Here's a really good example that, someone did last quarter, right? I've just written for you in advance. Then when the teams come back, they've either done something very similar to what you've done. Great. Big thumbs up, pat on the back, lots of celebration, or it's not there for some reason. And maybe that's for some reason that you actually haven't explained why it was structured that way, or you kind of made a mistake now that you look at it, and that's fine. Like, you need to work through this. And sometimes they just haven't got it because they haven't done enough reps. They don't understand their, domain well enough. They're just not, senior enough as a PM. Then you need to kind of go in and be like, okay, what went wrong here? Like, and then you can give them feedback, but that feedback is very, very objective, because you're looking at, here was the example, this was the quality bar, this is your work, it's not at that quality bar, and here's very clearly why not, and here's how you can improve it. So it becomes much more objective, it becomes much more a coaching issue, and that is, it's just a much more pleasant way to work, right? Because then you can say to people, hey, I'm going to make you better, I'm going to help you progress in your career. It's not a kind of, what is this crap kind of conversation.
Okay, so let's move on to getting a PM job. One thing you referenced in the Snap strategy section was, in a lot of PM interview processes these days, you have to develop some sort of document, or you have to develop some sort of presentation. And a lot of people are hitting the job market now who maybe had been on it 4 or 5 years ago. They're not used to this. And they're like, oh my gosh, how much time should I be spending on this? What should be the quality bar in this? What's your advice for those folks?
Yeah. So my advice is, like, firstly, understand what is the job to be done at this round of the interview. Like, probably it is to demonstrate to people that you can structure your thoughts, you understand their product. I mean, typically people ask the same kinds of questions, right? They're like, oh, think of an improvement to XYZ, or showcase how you thought through a feature, right? It's always the same sort of thing. And generally it is. They want to make sure that you understand the development process, that you can outline your thoughts, and you can talk them through what you do at each stage of product development. That means actually once you've got one presentation, the structure that you take from one interview to the next, like a different company, is going to be broadly the same. Obviously, like the insights are going to change, the context is going to change, but if you like to have your business objective as the first slide and you define that with a metric in a particular way, you're always going to have that slide. So just bear in mind that you don't want to be rebuilding your presentation like from scratch for every company, probably. Like obviously read the question, be clear what they're asking, right? But you should be learning, like every time you do one of these, you should be getting more reps and you should be getting better at it. You should be building on what you've learned and what you've tried in the previous time. The second thing I'd say is like, if you're doing one of these presentations, you're probably at the final round or nearly at the final round. So if you want the job, I would put in a lot of effort, because your chances of getting the job by this point are 20 to 40%, something like that, which might not sound that high, but like 1 in 3, 1 in 4, something like that. I expect that you've actually got a really good chance. And one of the key things that is going to weed people out is that, people just get the sense that you're not that into it. So go through the real product, go and buy something if it's not too expensive, go and speak to some real customers. Like the people who've actually really done their homework stand out like hugely, and it makes a massive difference. So, people hire on passion when the skill sets are the same. Absolutely. And even when the skill sets are a little out of kilter, they'll like passion goes a long way. So you really got to go hard on that. But also, I think you're a person. I mean, don't kill yourself over these things. Like, do think about this as like, hey, this is not a slam dunk. This is a kind of, I got a 1 in 3 chance. I got to give this a good go. Give it your best shot. But except that you'll probably have to do it 2 or 3 times to get that role. So just keep trying to make it a bit better every time.
And one tactic that I might add on to that I found people were doing with me when we had these presentations at Apollo for director and senior director roles was they might just ask for more time if they want to increase the quality bar. I feel like coming through with that passion is more important. Having actually had the time to use the product, having actually had the time to speak to customers matter more than just like quickly finishing the process.
Yeah, this is so great. I love it.
All right. So we have to talk about this. This is a podcast about product management. Some people's eyes are going to glaze over. Other people have been waiting for this question. How do you use AI as an interim product leader?
I think, AI is a really interesting space at the moment. Like there's a huge amount of noise around it, and that is generating a lot of insecurity for a lot of people. Me included. I'm worried that I'm missing out. I'm not kind of getting the full benefits. I think, how am I using it personally? So there are mainly 2 reasons that I'm using it. One is that sort of thought partner challenge where I never use it to write strategies or PRDs or anything like this from scratch. And I think that is counterproductive. But if I've got something, then, and that could be anything from a LinkedIn post to a strategy doc, where I'm just like, how does this feel? I'm running an email to someone. Getting some feedback on it can just give you another pair of eyes, give you a slightly different perspective. And that can be really powerful. Like when you've been staring at the same, document for, an hour or a day or something, and you're just like, I just can't see this in any other way. I think that could be really valuable for getting another perspective. The other way I'd use it is, so if you've got a lot of unstructured insights, AI can be fairly good at simplifying that. I think you do need to be careful, because I've tried this a few times and I've got variable results. So sometimes it's been really good at giving me pulling everything together and making it just a bit more digestible. Other times when I've done it, it feels like it's really kind of focused in on the first 2 or 3 bits of feedback and then kind of ignored the next 100. So I think at the there are these interesting little ways of using AI, and I'm always on the lookout for others, but there's nothing that's been like that groundbreaking for me yet as a PM.
The phrase I like to use is it's really good from going from 20% to 80% really fast, but you can't use it for the beginning or the end because it seems like it just lacks that creativity on the beginning and then it lacks sounding like a human on the end.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. That's a really great way of putting it.
And then on this synthesis component, what I've noticed is that certain tools are better than others. Like ChatGPT, like you just said, like it for the life of it cannot stop focusing on the first, 20% of whatever you input, and its context window isn't that long. On the other hand, Gemini is better, and then I feel like Claude is by far the best at actually understanding everything you input into it. Is that your experience with the tools? Which do you like?
I've been focusing on using ChatGPT almost exclusively at the moment. I kind of classify myself as a fast follower rather than as an early adopter. So I'm just starting to notice over the past month or two that people are really starting to talk about the different models a lot more than they used to. You've got some like very geeky, nuanced kind of discussion of models, for the past year or so, but it feels like really quite recently that people have started to pick up what some models are good for. And as that starts to settle down and there's a bit more of a consensus, then I may well switch tools. But for me, I think one of the decisions that I've made with just the way that I work and my life is that, I'm not going to be the person who spends 20 hours a week playing with different tools like that. That's not who I am. That's not where I add value. Like, as the consensus emerges in 3-4 months' time, I'm going to jump on one and I'll follow the consensus, and then I will get most of the benefits with much less of the effort.
As someone who does spend way too much time testing the models, I can assure you, and I hope you actually try Claude 3.5 Sonnet. In terms of both writing quality, it sounds way better as a PM. And it also understands product management. I've learned a lot better. I feel like ChatGPT kind of reminds me of a product strategist instead of a product manager, where it just wants to stay at that like very high level. So Sonnet is my recommendation there. Now, moving forward, so as you mentioned, people are feeling insecure about PM. And it's not just PMs, actually. It's the whole product team. Designers, they're looking at things like Playground AI, where you can put a prompt and you'll get an entire Figma file full of designs. They might even use your design system. And then engineers are looking at things like GitHub Copilot getting better and better over time, Claude Sonnet being able to build entire apps. All three of the product triad elements, and also product analysts, and they're looking at ChatGPT and how good it is at SQL and building dashboards. So all of the people in and around the product team are feeling pretty nervous about the future of AI. What do you say to those people?
I think everyone is going to feel threatened over the next few years by AI. And the best response that you can have is to get as good as you can at your craft. And that doesn't mean being the best in Figma, because Figma is not the end result of design work, right? Delivering value to users is the end result of design work. And so if I look at senior engineers, senior designers, what makes them stand out against more junior designers and engineers is generally not their technical skills. It's the business context and the customer empathy that they have. So those are kind of general skills that everyone needs to build, everyone can get better at. And they level you up in both a non-AI and an AI-empowered world. So that is where I'd encourage people to focus.
Okay. And then on the sort of trajectory of PM itself, we've all seen like the data that product management, it kind of peaked in 2021 after about 30 years of just nonstop up and to the right growth. The number of product managers in the last couple of years has been slightly down, even roughly a percent or so. With the advent of AI, people are getting nervous, like, oh, maybe designers can do more of the product management work, maybe engineers can do more. With Brian Chesky talking about founder mode and changing product management. People are seeing, okay, maybe we don't need as many PMs. They're looking at companies like Linear that don't hire a PM until very, very late in their life cycle. So putting all those data points together, people are worried about their job security. They're worried, like, is PM a field that's going to be around in 15 to 20 years? What do you think about that? This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication and SCIM provisioning. That's where WorkOS comes in, making it fast and painless to add enterprise features to your app. Their APIs are easy to understand so that you can ship quickly and get back to building other features. Today, hundreds of companies are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know like Vercel, Webflow, and Loom. WorkOS also recently acquired Warrant, the fine-grained authorization service. Warrant's product is based on a groundbreaking authorization system called Zanzibar, which was originally designed for Google to power Google Docs and YouTube. This enables fast authorization checks at enormous scale while maintaining a flexible model that can be adapted to even the most complex use cases. If you're currently looking to build role-based access control or other enterprise features like single sign-on SCIM or user management, you should consider WorkOS. It's a drop-in replacement for Auth0 and supports up to 1 million monthly active users for free. Check it out at workos.com/Akash to learn more. That's workos.com/Akash.
Look, either you believe that there are going to be jobs in the future, or you believe that we're going to live in some kind of tech utopia where everyone lies on the beach and has robot servants. Personally, I'm kind of the former. Everyone's going to have a job. Those jobs are going to be different. But I believe that, a mixture of soft and hard skills is sort of like of the human empathy and understanding and the analysis and strategic narrative, like that is going to be valuable for whatever the titles are in the future. And why do I think that? Because I guess that's a product of my own experience. So I started my career as at McKinsey as an analyst, and probably 80% of the stuff that I did as an analyst at McKinsey is what you do as a product manager. It's speaking to customers, and it's drawing charts, and it's coming up with narratives, and it's managing stakeholders, and it's all these things that you do as a product manager. And now back then, consulting, strategy consulting was one of the top jobs for people to go into out of MBAs. Now product management is one of the top jobs to go into out of MBAs, right? Very similar skill set, very different title, and slightly different context. So I think those things and that combination of things is very difficult for AI to mirror or to replace completely. And if it can replace that, it's like, well, what are you going to do? You're into the kind of tech utopia kind of way of thinking. So I guess I'm saying, like, focus on those things. There'll be jobs out there. Maybe they're not called product management, but they'll be called something, and there'll be a job for you.
Yeah, it feels like the soft skills, that's like irreplaceable. And nowadays, there's even more value on that as a product manager. Can you handle what designers and engineers want, what stakeholders want, and what users want? It seems like virtually impossible that AI could sit at that intersection.
I think it's very difficult, right? And I think it's also one of those things where I think the next generation are much better at it because they are being taught these sorts of things about how to be resilient and how to state your needs clearly and how to be respectful, and they're being taught those sorts of things in schools and universities in a way that I certainly never was. I look at what my daughter is being taught in nursery and in the first couple of years of school, and the breadth of emotional language and the skills she has at navigating different situations and navigating her peers is way beyond where I was at that level. So I think there's also a generational thing here of like the expectations for emotional maturity and handling are just going up significantly as well.
All right. That covers our major topics. We basically did a tour of every hot topic in product management. Now we're moving to the lightning round. Are you ready?
Ready.
All right. What's your favorite interview question of PM candidates?
I like to ask them what success metric they choose for a particular feature and why. And then I like to go into a lot of depth. So even asking them what events they choose to pick that, what time period, and why they justify that. I just find it's very strong at kind of selecting or kind of revealing how robustly people can think about the problem.
Okay. What's your favorite book related to, it doesn't have to be exactly about product management or growth?
High Output Management by Andy Grove is one of my all-time favorites. I learned a tremendous amount from it. And anyone making that transition from individual contributor to manager, I'd say it's a must read.
Okay. Outside of Hustle Badger and product growth, what newsletters are you most looking forward to hitting your inbox?
Great question. I read Lenny's from time to time. I think he's kind of like one of the originals in the space. Yeah, that's probably it at the moment. Yeah, not too many in my inbox.
Okay, well, what software product do you spend the most time in and give you the most joy when you're in it?
Gosh, I just love Google Suite. It just all works. I mean, that's like a very boring answer, but Google Calendar, Gmail, Google Sheets. I love a good Google Sheet. I write scripts for Google Sheets. I've written Google Sheets that do crazy variations on Minesweeper when I worked in games. I've written Google Sheets that will randomly put together a kind of list of guests for a dinner party and then email all the guests with the date. Yeah, love a good Google Sheet.
I didn't even know they could do that. Very cool. What product feature or product are you most proud of shipping?
Probably, I'd have to go with a couple of games that I actually coded myself and released onto the App Store, and they were just really satisfying for me because I had that complete ownership over them. So I shipped one game called Head of State, which was a political satire, and one game which was a mashup of Sudoku and Minesweeper called Sudoku Sweeper. Unfortunately, neither of them are on the App Store at the moment. Otherwise, this would be great marketing for them. But they were both incredibly satisfying to develop and then see get released and go live. It was, that was really special.
I had the same story. I used to work on a startup called Rap to Beats. And even though we stopped working on it, we had 40, 50,000 monthly active users. But Apple is always requiring you to update the code and update the designs and update the app so much with each version of iOS that it eventually just had to shut down. Yeah. All right. What commonly held belief or saying do you disagree with?
I feel throughout my career, which I like to think has been pretty successful, I've never really felt like I'm working that hard. And yeah, I get it. people work hard. And I think by probably some people's standards, I do work harder than average. But I also now, to my daughter's nursery, I frequently take, time off to pick her up early or spend time with my wife or whatever it is. And I think, working smart and on the most important things is much more important than working hard.
Okay. As someone very jealous of your content output on LinkedIn, I would want to learn more, but this is the lightning round. So what's one particularly memorable product failure that you learned from?
Oh my gosh. We had some, notable or painful disasters when I was at Depop. I think one of them was, when the CEO sort of berated me to build a kind of discounts feature. And eventually we decided we were going to build this. We had to completely rebuild the checkout to do it. And then we had to, do something else. It ended up taking, 9 months. And at the end of it, we realized that we'd sort of not really built what she was expected and not really built something that the customers wanted and something that really our business model couldn't support because, our margin that, as a marketplace, the margin that we could discount and offer discounts on was really small. And that whole process, that whole kind of 9 months was incredibly painful, and a great example of like why you never build things that stakeholders want you to without really understanding the context. And yeah, there were positives out of it. Like, there was a lot of reused code and good foundations that we built on, but overall, it was very painful.
Doesn't everyone have a story like that? All right. Where can people find you online, and how can listeners help you?
So people can find me on LinkedIn, or they can check out hustlebadger.com, where I have a lot of my thinking and articles and so on. And they can help me really by just messaging me if they've got a questions and then they think I can help out on a topic that I've picked up and they're not really clear what I said. I love providing a bit more clarity or pointing people in the right direction. So yeah, telling me how I can help them, that'd be great.
All right, Ed, thank you so much for this marathon session, and thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Akash. This has been great. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.